So I'm trying to think how to even start with this. I know there's a lot of mental files in the memory bank that might surface as I start in on it. I don't have a full plan on how to articulate it. This portion of the story is really complex, and another one of those where kind of battling the disinformation and stuff going on. I would just, one of the things that kind of kept me steady all these years is just staying fixed on the work in the spirit of what I was doing and what my life efforts were. I started to see things develop, and then I would have to kind of navigate in how it was absorbing me into other things on social media. There's a lot of different ways to look at it. People can say, are you just making this up? Like, why would I be incentivized to make this up? It's a huge distraction to the stuff that I'm trying to do. It could be, though, like if you look at it, people say, well, people can find a lot of patterns and draw upon certain patterns in life and make it seem that it's more than, there's all these different ways that people can kind of rationalize stuff and whatnot. I'm okay with it not being the case. I don't need this to be the case. I'm not trying to make this be about anything. Another way to look at it is, but anyway, on another note though, a lot of people had seen things play out. If you're wanting to at least look into it, you can find a lot of bizarre references, and there'd been people kind of suggesting from a distance. I think at some level there's like a functional fear of it, because people are afraid to, like, if there is something to it, to be associated with it, or not wanting to be doxxed. There is strange behavior that when people do try to connect to it or remedy issues, some things happen to them, or they in some ways get doxxed or something. I mean, in the past. Now that it's become more opened, I feel like there's less of that because there's less room for it to be an isolated thing. It's really a long story as to, a lot of things going on. I think another kind of like invisible barrier or like self-imposed barrier to all of this is that some people it goes off the page of a lot of ideologies that people take as their stance, I guess. Like, how do I simplify? Like, the opinions that people hold, the way that I approach stuff, a lot of times, for one, is like very theoretical and stuff, and it's not really everyone's cup of tea to analyze things to that degree. But I think in a lot of ways it also comes across as not fitting into their categories in the way that people have had to survive through, whether it be political parties or historical opinions or generalized references. And so I also, in the past, hadn't gotten a lot of support because what I was introducing was like too much of a shifted framework. And because of that shifted framework, and because I was challenging a lot of the ways that people were thinking about it, whether it be a religious opinions or political parties or some things functioning in political parties or public messaging and stuff like that. Originally, when I first started out, I tried to message various ones that I felt were more inclined to talk about stuff until we could like suss it out and then deliver something to the public. And that's the avenue that I wanted to go. When I first started getting feelings of things catching traction on social media, I didn't want it to be infiltrated into the public as the public be a buffer or it to trigger public issue. I felt like I knew I had something in me that I was questioning, but I felt like I needed a little bit of assistance to like articulate it among kind of like a focus group or something. And so originally I was trying to private message people after I started seeing this stuff growing and developing and turning into like a signaled, at first just kind of like a smaller group of signaled reference to stuff. I don't know the reasoning as to why people, maybe they just felt like it wasn't their... I don't know if initially people knew how to read this situation. I'm not really sure. I can't read their minds as to why they decided to just reference it still from the public influence rather than private conversations or group interaction. It could just be that this is just how it went and it needed to be pushed through in a massive public display of things. I don't know. There's things we could suppose about that. It could be that they just weren't up to speed with what I was trying to say. And that actually could be a major factor, because in retrospect, I noticed after people were kind of trading ideas back and forth that seemed to be function as the trade of ideas, there was disagreement. There were areas where I'd agree with some of what they were saying and then disagree. And so I did start to realize, okay, we're kind of referencing from a different framework, which influences the way I see and interpret religion differently, and a little more nuance in some forms of political approach, So it could simply have just been that there just wasn't yet a place for what we were all trying to say to really inhabit anything fully articulated yet. There's also other functions it could be that since we were tapping into the shift that was, because this started networking among a lot of people, it could be that the stage of consciousness in the public was simply just reaching a point where we all knew that something's got to give. And so the experience that we all share was we have our things that we're loyal to, but we know in and of itself it wasn't resolving the issues. And so there was probably, maybe to some degree, a consciousness of shift of things happening that people were kind of drawn to. So there was some type of attraction of these developing conversations. But, and it was reading into, maybe kind of like that, where they talk about the bottlenecking. I don't want to get too theory oriented, then I kind of lose a lot of people. I'm trying to keep this simple to this. But anyway, bottlenecking is kind of when you look at societal shifts. There's even people that study these theories of societal shifts or systems. There's another phrase of this really good author that someone in my family, after I was kind of trying to catch people up to some stuff, they started recognizing, just sharing info. Some stuff was simply just, I think, coincidental of people reading the signs of the times, and in the shared experience that people were in, the incubation or the bottlenecking of the direction of society that was going was just starting to, I think, centralize similar stories, right? I think, so it's not too far out there to suggest that there's patterns within history. A lot of people talk about these patterns within history. That's what I was kind of thinking about. I was trying to remember. Someone had shared with me some, and I forget what they referenced or called it, the turning or something, where there's this person that does this work on studying different stages of shift in society, and there are, to some extent, some kind of predictable behavioral dynamics that growth goes through. But I think what's also interesting at this stage of growth is that we're networked globally, and so we have this social media network, right? Anyway, though, so I don't want to get too deep into all of that stuff. It could be that as well. It could simply be that we're reading into similar testimonies and stories, and then when it overlaps with other stories, it feels like we're reading into each other's lives. So I do think there's a little bit of that too. I'm not trying to say everyone that falls into these this strange overlapping of ideas that are just very similar from all these scattered places are somehow involved in some kind of massive surveillance, while at the same time, though, we do have legitimate stories coming out where initially when people were kind of getting a feel for some strange stuff happening, and I had strange activity on my phone, on my computer, on other things prior to, when the Snowden case broke, and they came out and said there was mass surveillance going on with populations through electronics and phones and computers and whatnot behind the scenes. And then that whole Snowden movie and people having to secretly break the story because it was such a massive story, right? And then later, other stories coming out about mass surveillance, to the point where now we all assume that everything on our technology is accessible, right? They've come out with stories saying that basically, like in some ways, is easily accessible to our phones, also our smart TVs, our smart anything like this modern day technology, right, is able to simply be like collect and absorb information about us. So we're finally getting to that point where we do realize that, right? But then the question is, why would it matter with some of what you all are doing or whatever? Why would there be this strange, we could suppose about that, right? And for some strange reason, though, I think my main point too is like I still would continue to do that work. I'd still do the work that seemed to be overlapping with other people's work, other comparative writings, books, studies, and just kind of engaging, whether it be through blogs or whatnot online. But then the strange question was, like at some point in time, as this movement of just simple social media connection and utilizing social media connection to build and develop real world questions, conversations, whatnot. I mean, there's no question that that's happening. The trade of information and it creating some type of like closer and closer consensus as to what the world is asking for, what humanity needs, what the standard of like connection or common ground is. Like we have a tendency to be doing that, and that seems to be a mechanism of what social media and the sharing is doing. And then to see like this question, were the forces and the powers that wanted to have control over that, were they monitoring people? Were they shadow banning people? Were they surveilling select ones that were talking about, it had come out that people that were in discussions having to do with Islam and whatnot, and religion and Israel and whatnot were going to be surveilled. And so then that's coming out too. Anyway, I don't want to really get into this whole thing. Like I'm not really trying to spend too much time trying to defend the case or whatever. Like you can look at the patterns, you can look at some of the interactions and the sequences of the things that I had said and kind of gauge whether it seemed like certain ones in the know were privy to stuff and signaling back and forth and creating investments in relation to those patterns and building a case, right? So as I was saying, though, some of the themes that we're developing, this started at the end of 2011. People simply initially didn't seem like some major issue. It wasn't like some controversial thing. It simply just seemed like people started to recognize people having interesting conversations. And it did start to seem like initially the group that just kind of started to network and grow online had a similar story about needing to do something different and transformative in how religion was interpreted. And we just seemed to start to find each other more and more online and have similar stories and shared stories. And so it was just kind of starting to develop this community of interesting exchanges online. Nothing wrong with that, nothing controversial about it. Very productive, thought-provoking, growing this new sense of like tiptoeing into this community growing online. Prior to that, a lot of people were in their little like silos, working on ideas, engaged in podcasts, small groups, whatever. It just, social media era started networking everyone. And among that, because a lot of the atheist movement at the time, and I have my pros and cons about the atheist movement. There's things that I like about the conversation and other things I disagree with. I talked about that before. Then it initially was just of interest, it seemed like to me. It was just, whether it be signals from pundits or the atheist movement or this new religion type discussion going on, was just interesting and overlapping to the point where people seemed to be making it aware from a distance, that they were just aware of other people's contributions, and so they'd kind of respond. There was like this functional conversation going on that wasn't yet directly a meeting physically of people at that point. This theme, and then a response, and then this other response, and then da-da-da-da-da, and like kind of a functional debate from a distance as well. And it just became fun. Initially it was fun and interesting because it felt like we were all wanting growth, improvement, a breakthrough. And Initially, it just seemed interesting, and I enjoyed it at first. And I started to feel like it was kind of snowball. Okay, I don't want to get into rehashing the whole story. And then I started to feel like it entered into some territory which I couldn't even put parameters around. Because, things online, when it's public, you don't know how far it goes, to whom, what have you. But I did start seeing people, like platforms, and then people in association to those platforms would start making reference to stuff. And at first I wasn't really privy. I mean, I wasn't naive about stuff, but I wasn't really in the circle of like entertainment industry or publicity or, major platforms like that. And I started to get the sense after a while that there were different types of audience, I guess you would say. And so I can't really say exactly. I mean, I have ideas on looking at the pattern of interaction and the references seeming to be made of different ones that would have incentive to try to like tap in or hack or access laptop stuff and whatnot. But I did start feeling like that eventually started to seem to happen. Instead of it just remaining in this like productive conversation and whatnot, it started to just strange activity happening on my devices and whatnot. And people making reference from a distance that would make it seem like they're surveilling my life. And almost like they wanted, so it kind of got into these strange signals and different ones signaling across the way. And it was almost like eventually they kind of wanted me to know they were surveilling my life a little bit, or maybe curious about my life. And I didn't think too much of it at first. It was kind of like an inclination. But then it was like just little hints about things, whether like something I was wearing or something that I was doing at a certain time or in a certain place. And so then I just started to kind of feel like, okay, this isn't just trade of ideas online. This is monitoring my life. And then there would be hints about like pictures and stuff, seemingly references that were pictures that were on my private computer or devices. And then it just kind of kicked off into just other weird behavior. And so then that was kind of the stage when I started to reference, like, hey, I think certain portions which seem to be kind of like in the entertainment media domain and people in that type of genre, there's also this associated other strange behavior that, it'd be different if they were just saying weird things or comments online and I could kind of track it and gauge it. But it just started to feel like other strange things, right? And so then I do remember reaching out to somebody and trying to explain, so then I just started to realize it was kind of like turning into this whole other thing. And I didn't attribute any of that strangeness to like the writers and the different ones that were kind of being professional and just trying to have these trade of ideas and whatnot. I actually tried to reach out to them, but it had become complicated at that time, because even though there was some productive conversation, there was a little bit of tension in the trade of ideas. And so it developed into like, if you follow philosophers or debate groups, they can be very loyal to their groups and whatnot. And so they'll have their certain opinions. And so it kind of got into the territory where I was like, well, I don't know how they're going to approach things. Some of them really got into their debate stuff. And then there started to be these hints. Gosh, I don't want to get into this whole story, but okay, I'll just kind of go with it. It kind of shifted to where there was this tension between the religion debates and the New Atheists at the time. And then there was this like media entertainment branch of it kind of becoming this audience. And initially it seemed fun because we were joking. We were like packaging the trade of ideas from a distance through a lot of joking and teasing, and it was just fun. Like that's just like takes the edge off, and it was like productive and whatever. But there was a little tension in the debates and stuff. And so let's see, how do I kind of skip forward? It actually turned out that, and I don't, in retrospect, I'll have to spend time thinking about how it took this turn. I don't know if I just was saying stuff a little too out there from the religious group, or they just weren't keeping the pace with where I was at, or they kind of were, but I think it was also just different. My approach to it was very different because I was really challenging. Like this is like, you can kind of tell now, several years later, you can kind of get a vibe of where I'm at with it. But initially it was like way far out there from how people were interpreting scripture and religion and stuff like that. And I don't know if people were just very cautious, or I just, even in some sense though, it turned out to be productive, even though it wasn't the direction I was going. I thought I was going to be more in the religion camp, and then it kind of brought me into so initially at that stage, I think people noticed that it was developing into a lot of different tensions. And so it happened at that time that I shifted to trying to find a space to negotiate among more of the atheists, because they were challenging things all the way into like simply the experience of life and existence and stuff. And so they were more comfortable going way beyond like traditional interpretations and whatnot. I didn't fully find myself comfortable in their camp though, because I wasn't just trying to take like an atheistic argument and whatnot. I just at the time didn't have a place really that represented what I was trying to do. But I did find that season of my life surprisingly getting a lot of support and traction and interaction that developed from the atheist groups. And I didn't really want to go too far in that direction though, because there was plenty of things I disagreed with. And so then I reached out to some other writers that were they were willing to talk about like going beyond those traditional frameworks as well. So then that's when I started having this kind of like private behind the scenes discussion with this person. I don't know why they continued to be so cautious. There's things I could suppose, and maybe it's for the best, but I kept trying to reach out and say, like, instead of this other discussion, like, maybe we should develop something so that I don't have to keep navigating this stuff. I think there was a lot of other things going on. I don't really want to suppose about it. And I do think it's because people still had their differing opinions. And so they would from a distance support, like, why don't you just, like, seeming to suggest, like, why don't you just publish your own full story so it can kind of kick off into more of, like, a shared discussion and get out of this, what had started to grow into this, like, strange thing going on. I would try to do that, but then strange things would, like, seem to follow with it, weird behavior and other stuff. So then I would try to reach. Anyway, this is getting too long. There's a lot that could be said about it. There's a lot of things to be supposed in retrospect. While we were like living through it at the time, I can understand why people would wonder, right? Like, is this for real? Is this fake? Is this like, but eventually we were you just gauge it by the quality of conversation. You just gauge by, is this productive? Like, even for me, eventually, because there's so many seeds being planted of division and bot farms and all of these other things, so much more to say. I don't want to really get into all of that stuff. It just takes so long to say all of the things over the years that developed. Very entrenched, continuous stuff going on for so long. I do think eventually, maybe in behavioral dynamics, I was just thinking about this last night. I think I'm getting off track from what I was actually going to talk about. I meant to talk about something else more specific. But I was just thinking about this last night. I was imagining sometimes things maybe are not like somebody sitting in an office room saying, oh, we're going to have this plan to do this, that, and the other. Sometimes it seems like people just become a function of the corrupt way by which they just simply exist. The things that they actually just do to survive. And so I was kind of thinking about this before with some of these like celebrities and these other characters that kind of have this strange dynamic, this signaled interaction online, and beyond that, these other behaviors. And I was thinking, it's not as though, I do think later things became very much more calculated. But initially, I don't know that they sat down together and said, hey, let's like develop this scheme and do this whole infiltration thing. We do know there are some groups that do stuff like that. There are these agencies and whatnot that infiltrate and monitor and watch what people are doing and try to develop ways to deliver messaging to the public. There are things like that. We know that even in like political party campaigns that a lot of people try to work really hard to curate the idea and messaging coming out, because if you can influence crowds, then you can influence the direction that things are developed, and investment and money, and it's like a feedback loop to, warring over how you want to develop and build and preserve your life and whatnot. So there are information campaigns and stuff like that. But in some ways, some of the strange behavioral stuff also could be attributed to these are just the way people act. Some of this stuff just started to overlap in the industry. And once, if you're trying to be a part of reform, we know historically, anytime people try to be a part of reform, even if you have the best intentions, even if you're diplomatic, even if people should have a buy-in to the idea of universal human values and corrective measures and justice, like everybody should be able to invest in that, right? But they don't. That's why we're here within this stage of history with war and conflict, is because even if ideally there should be something in it for everyone universally to behave within justice and universal human values and whatnot, they don't. People don't, because they have these other entrenched obstacles and behavioral dynamics and the other things that they alternatively do instead. And so at some level, those behaviors that they enact or behave in just automatically become a function of how they oppose, whether they're thinking about it consciously or not. They live their lives in behavioral dynamics, which network into overlapped influence and whatnot, to oppose systemic reform, because they by definition don't live within the standards of reform or repair or justice. So at some level, that injustice and disinformation somehow or another seem to like eventually cross my path. We could suppose why it did, what was the attraction, what happened, how did this snowball, a lot of things. And we can go back and forth on what it seems like and whatnot. But eventually, what I am suggesting, and what seems to be some influence of this, is that did happen. And then the question is like, who, what, where, why, when, da 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 da. And the main point still remains: what is the standard of justice, and what are these processes to have these reforms, and is that true about life and true about potential? And if so, what are these other, why are these other factors obstructing it and involving themselves and doing these other things? And but anyway, so there's kind of like that. I guess this is like me trying to reason through it, right? I wanted to get to, I'm like kind of off track from what I was actually going to talk about. I was actually going to talk about eventually when people started to seem to play to this type of framework, that eventually when the media, maybe this does kind of fall in line with what I was getting to. Eventually, when the media, some kind of entertainment industry and whatnot, functionally started to frame all of this as these divisive sides and dramatizations and like labeling various ones within these different references and whatnot. I'm trying to think, like, there's ways I can break it down and over time refine it and unearth those files from all these years of things happening. I almost feel like I kind of have to do that, or people are not going to go deep enough into differentiating between some of these like deceptions of things. But I kind of just right now want to do a generalization. So what I'm trying to get to is eventually certain politicians, celebrities, different ones, seemed to make reference to this major snowballed like conversation and whatnot. But there are also ways that they were kind of framing it to functionally create divides that were unnecessary. And so that in itself started to become this weaponization of like dividing groups. We know that this happens. Anybody that has ever done systemic work or advocacy for justice, you can study history. You know, there's accounts from, say, like the Black Panthers movement or other movements where whether they come out and say like the CIA or different branches similar to CIA would infiltrate groups and activist movements to sow strife between leaders, to create paranoia between movements so that they can obstruct movements from within. And we see that happen a lot. You know, maybe their defense would say, well, we deemed them as a threat. These activist movements are a threat. And so we're going to infiltrate them and sow seeds of division and have them turn against each other and corrupt the measures so that they don't achieve or accomplish any kind of actualized change or anything like that. You know, maybe their arguing point would be, because we hear this constantly, right? Well, this group is a terrorist. These activists are trying to dismantle and destroy civilization, or this, that, and the other, you know, whatever. People have their arguing points on different sides, but we just generally know throughout history that certain forces do that to different activist movements. They don't really sit and say, let's have like a constructive conversation about how to, like, you know, at times they do. That's where peace endeavors and negotiations actually are accomplished and happen in history. Whereas aside from that, though, there's like conflicts and infiltration and division, contention, and whatnot. So what I'm getting to is I both saw the potential in some of these movements and discussions and trade of ideas, and I still see that. So that's what I would try to focus on. But I also started to see it like come up against these other like behaviors that seem to want to infiltrate it and get control over it and frame it in a way that they could control how it was growing and the way it was growing and what people seemed to think about it or how they would think about it. And so I'm trying to think there, to simplify what it eventually kind of developed as, and I talked about this before, is that some media apparatuses seem to turn it into stuff like they kept trying to seem to find ways to turn it against different ones involved. There were all these different mechanisms, whether it was like men versus women, or the women's movement, like feminism and the patriarchy, or then they'd kind of shift and turn it into like Native activism versus Black American activism, or then it would turn into like marginalized groups versus like, you know, then it turned into like the supremacy or like intellectual supremacy of Western civilization, or it was just all these maneuvers of division, right? And anyone that's involved in like systemic reforms and whatnot, they know what that's like. They know those types of ways that people are pieced apart, and the shaming mechanism of this like supremacy type system, right? And these racializing, then it turned into like black and white and just all of these things, right? And it's not to say that that those divisions, the reason why those divisions are used is because there is something to them. There is something that needs to be transformed in how those approaches are used. But it really started to become very weaponized and amplified and whatnot. Eventually, and I'll have to think how this started. Different angles, and so I'm trying to think which angle I kind of want to attempt to try to give this a general scenario of how something's developed. I'm trying to get to this stage where I try to clarify what I was kind of mentioning about AOC, or what I had mentioned about how AOC, how it eventually gets into this complex scenario where it seems that AOC, why she seemed to, her and various other politicians and whatnot, seemed to approach the way that the October 7th, with like the Hamas situation and Israel seemed to develop, and that it was also a caricature of these other divides that people were playing to, and also why it seems like AOC and various ones, whether it be the Kardashian Jenners and different ones, seem to still side with this notion of Israel, supporting Israel in relation to these certain political divides and pressures, and helping to situate different frameworks of people being on the different sides, and functionally then pinning groups against each other. And here's the thing, like, there's some things I like about AOC. I feel like she also has a lot of things that I like that she advocates for, or there's some legitimacy to things that she raises the alarm on, and I'm not 100% against her. I'm not trying to fully villainize her. It could be that she just simply was deceived into playing to these games, but the thing is that I noticed her over the years, she did play to the divisions, and on the outcome of it was that she seemed to side with the Kardashian movement that was curated to be this mechanism of just one simple side of this like two-sided equation, and eventually will be incorporated together and ultimately supported by Israel and be freedom for the people and stuff like that. And they packaged it as support for women's rights, and it was this mechanism for women's rights. And they also tried to sell it as though like getting ahead of these storylines where it was for women, similar to now where there's a certain branch of Israel advocacy that is packaging itself as women's rights, anti-Islam, this kind of like protection against violence, protection against the patriarchy. It functions to say the stuff that people in the Democratic Party or liberal approach for freedom want to hear. But in practice, though, what I think people are starting to notice is under the surface, they're making deals with the very people that in their political campaign are supposed to be, like, say, having more transparency with ICE, where there's questions with the ICE deportations and stuff like that actually being associated and backed by connections with Israel. And so on one end, it's supposed to be all this freedom, but they get investments from people that are actually doing the opposite of what in their campaigns they're supposed to be trying to do. They're starting to become and I'm not saying they're intentionally doing that, but they just seem very much unable. So this was the stage where the Democratic Party and the establishment and how they were investing in all these groups and the way that they could tell their stories, the way that it was sold into the public, had this imagery of being in support of families. They could package it in the marketplace to look like freedom and kindness and all of this stuff, and to look like Western development and paths of success and combating the enemy. And they were functionally following a narrative that was falsely framing other groups to sow contention within communities, to label them within these false storylines, to get them to help destabilize other portions of advocacy in communities, then to get groups kind of fighting against each other. And then they would label it and choose one side to say, we're fighting for freedom and these guys are villainized. And so then they would kind of pick and choose who to villainize, and then they just would have this framework of this peace giving, right? So everyone else was like Hamas, or everyone else was like some like radicalized villains of Western civilization, or all these protesters are actually Hamas, or what have you. And at the same time, they would try to tell us the story that they were for like activism and human rights, but they couldn't go very far in saying that, because under the surface they had to continue these investments with Israel, where when people were saying, actually Israel in some stories have infiltrated the way that whether either side of the establishment party talk about ICE, and they were seeming to help infiltrate ICE to target populations that were having advocacy against or in support of like joining groups of activism. And they're functionally saying in some rhetoric like all of this street activism is functionally against Israel all the way down, right? And so they were using ICE as this kind of like apparatus to silence the populations and anybody that would come out to speak against Israel. And so ICE became very much seeming like a branch or a utility of Israel. And so at one end, they're supposed to be platformed as these celebrities that are all getting funding straight toward Israel, right? And saying all these things about freedom and systemic reform and whatnot, and then functionally silencing the populations talking about those things. And so to me, it just started to feel like, and then functionally then selling it as though they would almost kind of like dog whistle anybody that, if there were groups that were speaking out against it, they'd villainize them. And they would make it seem like it's these, like targeting these different sides of the divide. And it did seem like it was functioning in some forms of the establishment Democrat movement. So here's where it becomes even more entrenched. There's this whole, so I drew this picture, right? There's this other video, makes reference to, there's so much that goes, this is difficult to like kind of sort through this stuff. There's this video that I did on explaining how it seems that on either end of the spectrum, so if you draw this picture, there's a center, and then there's this like line that goes across, right? Like this, there's this line, and in the middle of is the center point. And on the farther out extreme seems to be this place where there's like the establishment politics, where Democrat, Republican establishment. When you get far out on that point, you see them converge, where they're geopolitically aligned. They call them like the war hawks, whether it be like the Hillary Clintons and different ones, like the war hawks, or like the Lindsey Graham. And they eventually, at some point, even though along the spectrum of domestic politics they have disagreements on things, when you get to the outer portions, they converge on geopolitical, the way that the world nations are geopolitically strategized to align through NATO and whatnot. And all the way down it goes to Israel. There's a secular version of support for Israel that you can kind of see on the Democratic side, and then there's the religious version of support for Israel on the far right side. But ultimately, they stack up the geopolitical benefits that they get for Israel. It's peculiar because at some level they still pressure each other for who kind of wins the title of Western civilization, but they still don't really have it. They don't have this type of authority to speak out against the improper way that Israel's infiltrating the surveillance apparatus, the security apparatus, the communication apparatus. Like, we've seen this. This is not like, this is stuff you see online reported, right? And what you also have to do if you benefit from that strain of politics, so that first is where it anchors on, right? And that's what is issued. That's why people within the whole spectrum have been out on the streets and advocating and whatnot. And then that's why there's this convergence where ICE, whether it be the version of ICE on either side, can help monitor. And I'm not saying all of ICE. There are some groups that seem to be trying to have the actual mechanism of what it's supposed to be for. Just like, like with police, there's some like good cops and various ones that are trying to serve and protect. And then there are some that are just thrown in there. Like they mass hired so many people that wanted to be a part of silencing people in the streets. And their main point was to silence the activism, which they also said was like actively like Palestinian support and Hamas. And like they were just generalizing these things, right? That's not to say there wasn't actual contention. This is why I say like this is hard to generalize because there's a lot going on there. Actually, though, and it seemed like AOC and various ones knew this, they were seeming to signal for. So the way that I started to seem interpreted was everyone knew. They knew reasonably that I wasn't some extreme right-leaning person. I was critiquing the right. I was critiquing the left. I was basically critiquing the establishment and what seemed to be barriers toward actual freedom. So I was kind of more in the center. I was among groups that were advocating for certain rights and wanting certain rights and change and whatnot. AOC and various ones within ties to like the Democrat establishment seem to associate. They fell into this framework where, and this is why I liken it to kind of the sides of the Kardashians and different ones that were turning it into false weaponization, false framework, so that they could functionally anchor on getting benefits from both sides. There were times where they were signaling sides to the right and the left establishment, and they were comfortably seeming to get like funding and investment and support from the establishment on either side, as long as they were in support of Israel and whatnot. Israel in relation to silencing any of the internal domestic advocacy. And eventually, because people were advocating, well, I don't want to get into all the details. It kind of turned into what it seemed like is they kind of characterized this strange movement of like the Democrat establishment as this power to silence. So I felt like they falsely characterized various ones intentionally so that they can kind of like signal animosity towards them as being anti to freedom. And so they'd falsely characterize activists and different ones, like myself included, and the movement that I was about as being like opposed to the quote unquote freedoms of the Democrats, right? A lot of other activists got this treatment as well. And so it started to seem like we were like tripping over this like mechanism of these like establishment. So I took a short break there. But so one of the points is like, it could be that AOC, because I do tend to think like she does try to advocate for people and whatnot, but I do think just like a lot of different politicians, you can only go so far until you confront having to work through some of the systemic forces and stuff like that. And so along those lines, though, it also seems like she just tends to believe in the rhetoric sold for the side of Israel in terms of Israel being in conflict or at war with like the general populations and advocacy and stuff like that. And so the question is, why does she believe that? And I tend to think she has been made vulnerable to it because from what I had seen, the various ones, she has been made vulnerable to having to side with Israel because those on the other side of activism and those that were following the international occurrences going on and this like connection to like how this development started with like Schumer and Hillary and the Kardashians and different ones. Like, Google it, find it. We're part of this other side, and a lot of celebrities and different ones. And so I tend to think she got caught up in advocating for those movements and the package deal that's associated with it. And so through experience, everybody, different ones on the other side, know that she was a part of it. And so then she's kind of stuck having to advocate for Israel because Israel implicated her in that, and she played a part in it. And so even though I feel like she wants to have change in society, and I think if she wasn't controlled by that mechanism, she would, want to follow through with what's helpful for society. But she did play that role. And I saw her playing into the political competing contention of it and taking that side and doing the things that the Kardashians were doing, implicating people on different sides, playing to that framework and recruiting people to play to those sides. And it ultimately served the media apparatus and the false framing of it. And so it's difficult at this point to see. So here's where it gets even more complicated. She does spend a lot of time trying to reclaim her base and advocate for domestic issues by attacking Elon. And there's this whole thing with her and Elon, right? Even though I tend to feel like there definitely is legitimate, this is why politics and all this like investment behind the scenes, it becomes difficult as to what really is justice. Because everyone starts using the language of it and the selective points of it, and then they follow through and they're part of investments that actually prevent justice. And even if they don't mean to, people get into politics, and that happens all the time. You get swayed by certain forces and pressures in the public. So this is where it becomes even more complicated. If you listen to the whole history of how I've seen it develop, and I was saying different ones wanted Elon at one point to buy Twitter because there was this whole thing going on, and they were being silenced by certain establishment Democrats. It's hard to like suss all of this out. I still tend to think though that Elon is kind of getting played. It's kind of this whole scenario that you see where these historical things happen where certain characters are trying to counter the misinformation or disinformation and the excesses of stuff. And then they end up playing to, like, reacting to it in such a way where they kind of lose some of the credibility of their distinction as to why they got situated in that in the first place. So anyway, there's a lot more to say there where I do feel like he fell into that trap where there's a lot more that happened around there, and I could spend some time talking about it. We can go back and forth on these discussions and whatnot. But on a simple note, there's a lot more that goes into this question of AI. There are concerns, there's legitimate concerns to have. It is at a stage where there's a lot of excess. There's worry about the natural resources and water and other aspects of AI like surveillance and what about people's creative rights to their work, and just so many other questions having to do with hyper technology on the world stage, and that it does not yet seem to have responsible characters delivering it to the public. It seems very weaponized, and so there's all these other things that like legitimately need to be discussed in terms of AI. And I feel like that is a place where she's regenerating a sense of confidence, right? But on the other side of it, there's a lot of different approaches to... I understand there's this tension between her and Elon seems to represent a major player in backing the win for the Republican Party, opposing the Democratic Party. And not a lot of people, I think, knew some of the other nuances going on in the public influencer, celebrity, investment kind of a wing of things. And I think a lot of the public were trying to make a decision based on the information that was being delivered. And I tend to think a lot of politicians and leadership actually knew other things going on. We could go into why it seems the case, and it definitely seems the case. And it's hard, I'm pretty cautious about saying things like, or using terms like definite or 100% or things like that, because I'm usually very nuanced and cautious. I always leave room for the error, but I'm, pretty sure that through watching the patterns play out that people were privy to stuff. I think it was in that realm of gauging the public and not really like the standards of other standards of transformative values in the system. A lot of politicians there was just this tendency to play to like that sweeping generalization. There's a lot that can go into, and maybe that would be another audio as to the difficult entrenchment and deception in the different establishment parties, and then trying to seek for what was the alternative approach for domestically for populations and their concerns pertaining to what establishment politics was doing. But anyway, just to kind of go in this generalization, I don't totally villainize AOC, but I did tend to see that she was involved in this stuff, even to the point where there had been a long time approach, like spanning years, where some of the establishment Democrats seemed to be creating, like I was saying, this imagery of combating, like you've heard the things that Hillary Clinton had said, like the predatory black men and the predatory violence, and they seem to be in like generalizing with these types of like investors, like the Schumer, well, because a lot of these characters were getting pushback from various ones. There's a lot that can go into it. Maybe it'd be a long conversation where they'd say like the manosphere, there was like the women battling the manosphere, the patriarchy. There was some of that, but there was also, like I have been trying to explain, people that were actually watching it knew that there was deception intertwined in this false perception of the women's movement that had connections to forcing a type of connection and investment to Israel. I think another talking point, though, or another form of discussion is what is the long game for the establishment and how they both converge on support for Israel, even when you follow it down. And then in practice, though, domestic politics, they have differing stances, but then they still geopolitically align with the investment apparatus and geopolitical strategy of Israel. How do they square that, right? What is their goal there, where they converge, but then where they seem to agree on that mechanism of support, the way that Western civilization is developed, and then how to control the populations through that. But then they have difference of opinion on domestically how it looks, right? In the local politics and stuff like that. There's a question to have there to kind of piece that apart, because when you follow it down, even within Israel, there were questions coming out where there was a divide happening in Israel between I think it's Likud party, which was like the conservative party, I believe it was, and then I forget the descriptive name of the other opposing party. Anyway, this is what Charlie Kirk had talked about in his interview, I think with Patrick Bet-David, where he was saying that his reports from Israel, and he had visited Israel, was that there was a similar divide in Israel politically between like conservatives, liberals. And people weren't agreeing with some of like the conservative party, and that's what they were labeling as, a lot of people were labeling that as the place of this Israel conquest narrative, religious Israel and whatnot. And so they kind of get away with this idea of selling themselves as pro-democracy and pro-freedom, as though they weren't really benefiting from the investment in Israel geopolitically and how NATO aligns its world network and all of these other factors. And so they could say that and act like they're not a part of this like colonialism framework and this Israel conquest narrative that has had ripple effects throughout nations, but then in practice still invest with their investment, and so still not budge on ultimate support for Israel. And so it was a lot of language. So that's another conversation to say, in some ways they're on the same team, and in other ways in practice they play for the same goal, but then they think that they're going to like change the way it's ran once they achieve that level of supremacy or something. But anyway, that's another topic. So getting back into this though, what you find is that on some level there is room for AOC and the Democrats to resist. Like, they have these talking points. They resist those that supported this movement for the Republican Party, whether it be like Elon, Joe Rogan, different ones, right? And they kind of make these talking points and references, like they combat Elon because of AI and stuff like that. But then there's even more to the story of AI. If someone was really getting into, so I'm not denying this. I'm not denying that there needs to be legitimate conversations about AI, about the effects of climate change, about, like the health and wellness of and preservation and sustainability of our natural resources and whatnot. But then it gets into these talking points about, what about the other competitors of AI? What about the story? If you are really wanting to look into legitimacies and standards of AI, what about the competitors and the stories behind AI, suggesting, and this is why it just, maybe needs to be looked into, suggesting that there was even like certain competition with AI that had ties to surveillance and the war apparatus and functions that support the Democrat Party. And so in some ways, it's almost like packaging it as saying, we have concerns about AI, we hear your concerns about AI, but then only selecting for a side of AI that would dismantle oppositional resistance, and then like kind of omit the benefit that one is getting from AI to support their investors. And so it kind of seems like a stance of omission with the appearance of really talking legitimately about the depths of the concern. And then also it's packaged in this whole climate change and trying to speaking the language of what the public seems to want to hear domestically, while at the same time being a part of these forever wars that are some of the main factors for generating the issues that we see in the obstructions where climate change becomes even more of an issue, is the warfare machine and these forever wars. And so they do speak on that after it becomes something that seems publicly palpable. But at the same time, there's this omission about it being driven by Israel. And so it always becomes this play on politics where it's driven by Israel. And the war, it was the force of hand through Israel and all of these other factors, or just even omitting that that it's about Israel. And then at the same time, also omitting that Iran likely knows that AOC was a part of the mechanism that was symbolic in what October 7th was even about. And so even if, say, she got put in a position of negotiation, there would likely be no trust in her speaking on behalf of legitimate negotiations, because she was on the side that Iran would be resisting, because she was a part of the whole mechanism that was being used to obstruct systemic reforms. And she knows that, and that's why it seems like her and various ones know they're in no position to actually dismantle the war machine. And so they just speak on it as though deflecting and saying it's on everybody else to dismantle the war machine, when they're situated in the very mechanism by which helped to fuel it. And nobody would trust that they would want to dismantle it, because they can't even speak on some of the main factors now. And so if they're not really going to be able to speak on dismantling, they have no intention in practice to dismantle any of those perpetual effects, because they based themselves on perpetuating it, and their investments are ensuring that they perpetuate it. Their mechanism that they function through is the forcing of the hand through Israel to keep that going. And so they can just look at other leadership, whether it be Biden, whether it be Trump, all the way down. You see the videos about every U.S. president where, because of these mechanisms, their hand is forced and they get thrown into these wars. And even when they try to talk about it, other people dismantle it and pretend that they shift it into being about saying what the public wants to hear about domestic affairs and whatnot. And then knowing that they never really speak on those, and they, in practice, just continue to go forward with that same approach, and then provide for people selective portions of domestic favors and whatnot. And I think my tension and frustration about it is that she, at this point, I don't know, I'd have to think about it, like what she could say to correct that false framework that she was invested in and helped other influencers invest in. And they turned it into these mechanisms of these high-ranking investments of women. And I think in practice they actually believe it, and that's why I don't think they have a place to say it. Some of them actually believe it. They believe the story that came out in the reports about how Israel framed it. They believe that it's this women's rights movement. So they're just in no place to really look at the nuances of what it takes to dismantle this whole position that keeps all of these surveillance and like over-policing type apparatuses in place. They don't really have a mechanism to dismantle it because they seem in practice to show that's what they actually believe is the case. And they speak that similar language. They try to like piece apart different portions of arguments. I think what also fuels it though is I don't think Elon handled it right. He had come out and he tried to explain before, and he had said something like, because I was following this before, because you listened to the audio I talked about where Cube and other ones were wanting him to buy X because everybody was getting canceled when they were trying to talk about activism and whatnot. And he did come out and try to say he was a Democrat and he believed in all of these things, and then it had become excessive, right? Even that was different for me to hear, because sometimes all we see is, you know, a lot of times there's so much to follow online. All you see is the more extreme versions of people and their practice and what they do. And you don't always hear the sit-down conversations where they explain, look, I'm open to this stuff. I'm not really an extremist. I'm about free speech and whatnot. Even so though, when I heard him kind of sharing his opinion, and he was basically kind of open to stuff, and that he was trying to seemingly figure out how to dismantle some of the excesses and the ways that this like propagandist machine was like waged against him. I do feel like maybe he was trying to be somewhat honest about that. But I also think he fell for what a lot of people do, and to put it in generalizations, what a lot of men do is they get caught up in these, like, they don't always know how to track the nuances between these kind of disinformation campaigns. And then they result to like generalizations. And then once they result to these kind of like sweeping generalizations and opposition, they can easily get recruited into kind of trying to resist with too much kind of like sterilization, or like going in guns blazing, or that kind of thing. And so even though I can kind of follow where I'd seen stuff from a different perspective take place, and I'd seen how they were incentivized to want to resist these disinformation campaigns, and the way it was being divided, I also didn't agree with how they tried to remedy it. I didn't agree with some of the measures that he had taken. I didn't agree with, there was some, like I said, it's different when you see sweeping generalizations online or like certain clips, and then when you hear someone sit down and talk about what their intention was. So that is different. I do admit that. And so it sounds like some of his intention was that there was a lot of waste. And it's kind of one of these things, right? So like if someone is, so like any theory, any kind of theory proposal, any kind of system of belief, whether it be religion or what have you, there could be good factors in it. There could be things that draw your attention. Take, for instance, if he was trying to get into like conservative values and he wasn't really trying to like make it too religious, and he was open to certain types of reforms and whatnot, or you know, like democracy and open public and free speech and all this stuff. But he was saying there's this other excessive stuff, and we're trying to figure out how to properly dismantle some of it or diffuse some of it in like the political sphere. And so maybe he had become attracted to some like people saying it's rampant. It's the rampant, you know, like excesses in government, and we need to make a smaller government. And so he could have at some level a legitimate desire and attraction to say, I don't know, maybe like libertarianism or something, or wanting to shrink the government, or he legitimately thinks that he believes in a shift of a different approach to like governing. You know, it could be. But in practice, just like when a lot of people can have a certain belief system, but in practice, maybe they approach it in a way where they're just like cutting away things in the wrong way. I don't know. But I'm basically saying I do tend to think, but I'll give room for, you know, other explanations. Or I also admit I haven't spent time. There's too many things all over the place. I haven't spent time listening to his long form discussions and whatnot, or conversations and explanations. It could be that he, you know, did have intentions to like minimize the budget and make repairs. But I also think he was fueled by certain attacks. Like there was a weaponization that seemed to be somewhat a part of it. And it seemed like, I mean, he did seem to find some, like, just some of the approach just didn't seem like, in practice, the way that things should have been transitioned. I guess I'll just kind of keep it simply like that. And I do think that he was also being fueled. It seemed like he also ended up having handlers around him to where the direction that he was going was ensured to be under the control of Israel as well. Certain ones around him ultimately were seeming to sell different ones talking points about activists in the streets and like the whole ICE thing, right? Which then the Millers were, I guess, even sharing living quarters with him and were direct influences to formulating his opinions and whatnot, and giving information, and other people giving him information that these certain people were trying to assassinate him, this, that, and the other. And they basically kind of seemed to functionally push him into the hands of like Israel alliances, which is peculiar. So we have like AOC and Elon battling each other, and they're both entrapped in this whole like Israel compliance, which is peculiar. And they're kind of battling it in these different ways where functionally they have different ways of delivering their language. But one part is leveraging money to control some budgets that go out to in other avenues, and one way is leveraging money to control the other perceptions of alleviating like issues in the public, while at the same time not really being able to transform these other mechanisms that are kind of like the driving force of these things. And then ultimately, even though they'd have this language about different opinions on ICE, it flows back into this influence of Israel using it as a type of apparatus to control information and advocacy. And so there's just all these strange dynamics attached to the rhetoric that people are given and messaging that's given to the public. And they can only go so far with these measures, you know. And, you know, at the end of the day, like, I do want a more functioning society. I do want to figure out better ways to like relieve burden for citizens and have transparency and safety, and also a type of proper restorative approaches to harm done through improper you know, like occurrences that happened with ICE and these other factors and some of these, like regain trust in the public for serving the populations and whatnot. So anyway, there's that whole thing going on there. There's a lot of things to kind of think about. I do think people are kind of weaponizing the language of it. Some people are I do tend to think some of the characters like Elon will kind of fall into the trap of like, when people follow politics, they kind of know. Some of it isn't even just falling into a trap. I think it's some opinions and things he needs to work through. And I also I'm not really one that looks at the future as like hyper technology. But at some level there is technology. We have to enter into these conversations and kind of look at what's going on there. And so there's room for those conversations. There was people raising the alarm, though, and saying, well, if people really wanted to, and I haven't spent enough time on this, it is something kind of like on my radar. People were saying if, to some degree, if they wanted to look at legitimate conversations of what's driving the excessiveness of the AI competition, I guess there was some questionable antics that had happened, some questionable business approaches that Elon was trying to bring up, and I guess had happened with other competitors in AI. And you just don't see various ones talking about that because ultimately those strategies and those questionable antics seemingly suggest to serve Israel. And it just continues to seem to be something that we can't really have legitimate, responsible conversations about any of these things if we're not continuously questioning why is Israel, or these connections to Israel, alliances, geopolitical alliances, turning the other way and allowing it to just go forward and giving appearances that they're trying to monitor these situations, but they're just giving a full green light to Israel being rampant with these technologies and utilizing them, and then only speaking against the various ones that would be bringing up, some of these concerns and whatnot. I don't know what happened in some of that stuff. It's a story that I hadn't followed. Some others in the Democratic Party had tried to come up and talk about it, and then they were even monitored by Israel. And I just don't think there's confidence that AOC and her refusal, getting too comfortable with the language, the framework, the propaganda, the misinformation, and the weaponization domestically to the public in relation to Israel's rhetoric. I just don't think it puts her in a place to legitimately speak on behalf of, domestically for the concerns that people literally need to have done. I would like to think that. I'm not saying that I think she is intending to have malice. I don't know if she just, similar with Kamala. I don't think Kamala, the issue there that had happened was she wasn't even empowered enough to be able to get out of the trajectory that was starting to happen. It seemed like the only thing she would have been empowered to do was to kind of manage the appearance of things domestically for people and just let the other stuff kind of geopolitically run rampant. And so it wasn't as though I wouldn't imagine her wanting to make those change. Eventually, though, it didn't seem like she did, because she started to also try to silence the activists talking about it and the concerns that they had. And so in some ways it just seemed like different ones in the establishment just allowed the functional silencing of the activism in the streets and intended to just let the establishment apparatus do what it needed to do, and then try to seek support to reestablish their movement through those that the establishment serves. And so they started to gain connection and communication for their campaigns through the wealthy, through the celebrities, through the framework that they were using, the weaponization they were using against the general population, the way that they were infiltrating and instigating and provoking different communities to be at odds with various ones so that different movements would seem to be pinned against one another. Even that just infuriates me because it caused a lot of harm and it instigated legit channeling of destruction to communities. And I felt like they were directly a part of that on purpose. They knew that that was happening. And the fact that even if they say, well, that was a mistake, we didn't realize that's what we were doing. The fact that you wouldn't realize that you were doing, are you even in the spirit of reform? Do you even recognize what speaking on in the spirit of liberation actually is then? How would we trust that if the mechanisms that you use help get us into these conflicts, refuse to speak on what actually changes it, are too comfortable and backed by those that support these mechanisms, don't want to investigate how it's all connected, and don't even join forces with those that are in the Democratic Party that are trying to speak on behalf of it? Like, you just in practice believe that that is the proper power to anchor your movement in, when there's growing support in suggesting that it isn't. And so I think for me, that's where it's like, I still believe in like the ability for people to grow into more liberal values and whatnot. I don't really find myself as, say, like a conservative in the sense where, because I generally do think we have it in us to grow into personal responsibilities, personal agency, where we can make informed decisions, we can treat each other with respect, we can live in more harmony. I'm not against some of the basic liberal values and things that we can envision, although I just don't see the establishment being a part of being among what it takes to actually allow that to happen without all of these other maneuvers that functionally keep us oppressed. And you only seem to find that happening in this other movement. I don't even know what they're calling themselves, even though I don't agree 100% with it, but like Massey and some of them, even though, like, if I was going to discuss with him, even though I like the idea of, like, in practice of how he's trying to, so one of the things that's of benefit with seemingly of his approach is that because he's minimized, like what they call big government, like, and I'm not even generally a person that's against quote unquote big government. I do tend to think, and that's a whole other conversation, but I can see in practice in that he's done that. In practice, he has loosened the ability for big government to have an improper hold on him so that he can speak on what is transformative justice. And so I see that and I recognize that. He and various ones that have done what it takes to be a part of this like transformative approach, right? But at the end of the day, I don't know that if there was a corrective measure. So I see it as a strategy for a corrective measure to minimize all the apparatuses that big government has on you so that it functionally prevents the ability for transformative change. But I'm not against if there is a corrective measure rooted in a corrective apparatus or standard that we can't eventually have some forms of like functional, what they call big government, abilities to like be farther reaching and allow for like undergirding types of transformative change and stuff like that. But it does make me start to think, though, that if it's like a pivot point, if it's an ability to like go through a stage of cutting away the entanglement so that you can begin a change, I am seeing, and I don't know that I would have said this before, because I am hesitant because I don't want it to be too much cutting away of things, but in practice, he seems to be open to all these other freedoms. And so I'm just saying that even though I've always tended to be, generally, as far as I can remember, except maybe there was one point several years back, but in general, I've always been like left-leaning, Democrat voting. It's kind of a weird place to be put in after I've seen things kind of play out. But it could be that once we get rid of like the control mechanisms and whatnot, we can shift to more of like what that looks like. I don't know. It's just hard to know where to go with it because you kind of have to strategize it. There is somewhat of a functional balance because some stuff that remains that is kind of more in the caricature or like the practices of Democrats, I still support. And, maybe we're all a lot of, if you, seen before the numbers of activism in the streets, I think maybe a lot of people feel that way and are recognizing, like being weaponized against and whatnot. It's hard to say, maybe AOC would make corrective measures on that. I literally see in my mind the times when she got into these power struggles and it functionally like pit communities against various ones. I kept saying over and over, it was a false framework. They just kept incentivizing that. Like, they just seemed fueled by a type of like political jockeying, and it just ran them right into the hands of these like really toxic investors, and that was their language and their talking points. I didn't spend enough time explaining. So I had said like October 6th, right, when there was these divisions and whatnot. I didn't spend a lot of time unpacking that. There's a lot of things to suppose there. I don't know if I want to go into that right now. I'm going to try to, I guess, summarize some of it. You started to see this development happening, and it started developing years back. Even Sam Harris, when I was talking about the atheist movement thing, they started to back themselves in the Democratic Party by suggesting that they were this standard of like women's rights and women's freedom and stuff like that. And they're directing it directly against Islam. And on the surface, it seemed like, okay, that seems like a good selling point. This is like the civilized world and freedom and freedom for women, and that's how it was packaged. And so they had this major recruitment for this type of movement, and it functionally kept certain I'm trying to think how to simplify this, because this goes into this whole systems thing, and I'm actually pretty sure I talked about this before. Sam Harris took a stance for Western development with his main weapon against Islam was women's rights. And it seemed like. And so he recruited this big following, and he had this women's movement and whatnot. Here's the thing that's complicated. It's not to say that there aren't areas within Islam that need improvement and whatnot, or that other countries that have tension with the U.S. don't have areas where they legitimately need improvement and whatnot. But it's the same standard that they were using domestically against various ones as well. And it was this approach that functionally became a type of preservation for the westernized system or what have you. And the standard that they would also use against Islam and other enemies of the system, they would use domestically, and they would separate things domestically into areas of crime and this whole standard all the way through that was basically kind of separating between marginalized communities and whatnot. And these kind of standards of, in a sense, almost like an arguing point that it had come to the place where the reason for the benefits of the system are because it's supreme and it's peace, and others that are against it are like the enemies or crime-ridden or hostile, and there needs to be this corrective measure. And so it started to functionally become a recruitment method along those lines, and gathering into it like the benefits of the investments and arguing points for why it was supreme, why it was intellectually superior, why it was the proper path for women's rights, and all of these things, right? A lot of influencers and a lot of those platforms then became this kind of like structure to pull women into that direction. And so then they also had these recruitment methods that were like, and then these are the people we are against, this is what we preserve. And so even when people would try to pretend to speak on behalf of negotiations and reconciling historical divisions, in practice they were just platformed and anchored by that framework. And over the years, people simply just saw that take place. This is why when I started to resist Harris and various ones, I knew that I had to have a good argument for remedying this whole thing with Islam. And not only that, just out of compassion and just out of realizing the falseness written into the way people were talking about marginalized groups and demonizing groups and trying to justify this whole supremacy shift and whatnot. And so there was this growing movement where people were saying and trading notes and saying that this isn't true. But in function, they were connecting with a lot of the Democratic Party and the establishment that were taking that route and signaling to various ones to take that route. And so then they were functionally creating tensions between communities, and then it would filter it all through to this kind of like these investments. This is why I say it's difficult to trust their rhetoric when they are trying to, in practice, like they're investing in that standard and also creating disinformation for others, because other people that would be legitimately trying to function through what was supposed to be the democratic values and talking points and what they were trying to say as they were negotiating for people, they would feel confused because not knowing these other people were undergirding it with these other investments that were undermining the very thing that they were hoping these endeavors were creating transformation for and whatnot. Some, though, that legitimately were countering that, were also in the midst of it setting up like useful democratic values in communities. So there was also that function as well. It was all just so overlaid with all of this stuff. So then it got into these talking points where to really combat that and diffuse the ability for that distortion to occur, you had to be able to talk about what was the differentiate, like looking at like, is this true about crime? Is this true about this like one path of success and supremacy of intellect? And is it true about the historical barriers and whatnot? Is it true about like Islam and whatnot? Is it true about Israel versus Islam? Is it true that Islam is generating world wars? Is it true, or what is Israel's place within it? Is it true that Israel is seeking for universal human values and others are the enemies of that? Or are they resisting universal human values and in practice generating other enemies because they refuse that? So there just became all of these other things and talking points. And so this is why I eventually had to take the what I call systems approach. And I had to just start calling out different ones that were trying to like display themselves as though they're speaking on behalf of liberation, but they were invested in the whole system that was opposing actual freedoms for people. And like I said, in practice, I think eventually, because the mechanisms self-perpetuate after a while, they, I think, started to believe that they had to keep towing the line for that supremacy and those types of interpretations, because they had invested in it so long that they did start creating enemies. So this is why I say some of those that had invested in that approach over time did create enemies, and so they can't go against that, and they're not really in a place to actually reconcile it unless they start pointing it out and recognizing it and doing something different. But then they would have to remake their whole stance, and I don't know that they would do that. And so they select from among each other, pretending as though they're calling each other out and making corrections, but they're not. They're functionally still under the protection of the standard and that mechanism and that framework, and they pretend to have negotiating public conversations and never intend to really change it, because they have put themselves in a position where They just have to keep doing that because they've corrupted people and maligned communities and had done these things for so long. So I don't know, it's quite an entanglement to think about. And as I was saying, it is difficult because people generally will believe what they say. They use the talking points of all these places are crime ridden, get rid of activists, like the system and its whole like supremacy and what it believes about its historical enemies, etc., etc. This talking point of like Islam is the free world and Islam is the barrier. And so it is just this question, like seeing if there's a corrective measure to that. And anyway, I'll leave it at that. I feel like this was kind of difficult to try to talk through all of this. There's more to say. I'm even cautious about it because there's such a mechanism of people's perception that they still might get it wrong as to where I'm coming from. Politics does have a tendency of having different ones around various ones that are functionally their handlers. And even if someone has good intent, eventually they become so entrenched by leveraged forces and investment that it can undermine what they're actually trying to be about. So I do give it that, like, I don't think everybody is intentionally trying to cause harm or be a part of these like oppressive systems as much as like it's difficult to find mechanisms to get out of it, because anybody that tries to, you can see what generally tends to happen to them. At the end of the day, though, yeah, I still believe in some of these other values and approaches and the benefit for communities. It's just trying to get all of these distortions out of the way so that it can actually start happening, so we can actually have legitimate conversations about sustainability and health of our communities and stuff like that. Anyway, I guess I'll leave it at that for now.